What happens when a man's body is no longer under his own control? How does classical art depict this? And what emotions do their bodies bring up in us, the viewer? Today we're going to look at 4 very different paintings that are found in the National Gallery in London, but all have something in common. They are a depiction of the male body in agony and ecstasy, sometimes at the very same time. From tortured saints to drunken satyrs, this journey through the male form in classic art will reveal not just beauty, but surrender, sacrifice, and raw human power. We'll see the male body beaten down, even subjugated, and at the same time exalted, even when it's on knife's edge. Each of these masterpiece paintings has a unique twist on how we see men and their bodies, and all can be seen in person at the National Gallery in London today. It's one of the top 5 museums in the entire world, and I love doing deep dives on some of their more remarkable pieces. This first painting is called Christ Contemplated by the Christian Soul, and its main character is the male form. I'm going to explain what you're seeing and what that says about how we paint and how we see the male body. The first thing I want to say is that most of the works in classical art are going to be either mythological or religious. That does not mean that you have to be religious. It does not mean that you have to be Christian to understand and gain enjoyment from these works of art. What you do have to do is to understand that at the time, the dominant society was religious. So anything that wanted to be expressed had to be expressed within that container. But once you understand the limitations of the container, you can understand the common threads of humanity that we have with people that have existed across time, no matter what religion, and how they're shown, sometimes subtly, within that very container. This is by Diego Velázquez. For those of you who are new to art history, that's great, welcome. Diego Velázquez is one of the most famous Spanish painters ever. You have Velázquez, Goya, El Greco, and Picasso, which are basically the 4 Spanish painters that are known throughout time outside of Spain, in my opinion. Velázquez is one of the most important. He's one of the earliest of the famous Spanish painters, and he is Baroque. That is the term used for that style of painting, Spanish Baroque specifically. What are we looking at in this painting? We see Christ bound to a column, seated on the ground after or during his flagellation, looking probably outward or upward toward heaven with sorrowful, searching eyes. To the right, we have a young boy in that whitish blue. He represents the Christian soul. That's why the painting is called Christ Contemplated by the Christian Soul. That young boy is representing what they want us to do, the Christian soul to do, is to look at the suffering of Jesus in his flagellation. Above him is an angel who gestures slightly towards Christ, kind of guiding the soul's attention. And on the floor lie the instruments of torture: scourges, rope, a whip, and a little bit of blood already. The flagellation of Jesus is a very popular theme in classical art, especially Baroque art. There's a famous flagellation by Caravaggio. There's one by a follower of Michelangelo in the Prado. There's one in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art by Crespi, another Crespi in the Prado, a Guercino, many others, and I will show some of the other ones so that we have a contrast. So what is the flagellation of Christ for those of you who aren't familiar with the Gospels, or maybe not this part? Well, in the book of John 19:1 it says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged." Historical reason. Under Roman law, flagellation was a common prelude to execution. It was meant to weaken the condemned spirit, to intensify their suffering, to punish them more, and sometimes even to extract confessions. Victims were usually stripped. Now here we see the white cloth around. If you watched any of my other videos, I talk a lot about why we show nudity in art and why we don't. And in these really religious periods, they generally tend to cover that area up. In classic Greek and classic Roman art, they showed everything. And you start to see us showing the nude form later as we approach modern art. But for most of Western art history, there's going to be a little bit of covering of that area that it was believed was important not to show. So usually victims would have been stripped and tied to a pillar or post and whipped with a flagrum, which is a Roman whip made of leather thongs with bone and sometimes metal tips. In Jesus' case, Pontius Pilate ordered the flogging, possibly hoping that this brutal punishment would satisfy the crowd and maybe even prevent the crucifixion. But as we know, that did not happen. This is important for Christianity because the flagellation is part of what's called Christ's passion. It's the suffering he endured that redeemed humanity's sins. By his stripes, we are healed, is actually said in the book of Isaiah. Artists often depict the intimate vulnerability of the male body in this scene. It gives them an opportunity to do so, not just as torture, but also as an act of submission and spiritual offering. So we're seeing Jesus submit to the authorities, saying, my body does not matter. The world, this worldly realm does not matter because the spirit is the only thing that matters. And that's what you're supposed to think also as a Christian. So there's a deep message here using just the male body and this scene alone. This moment also allowed artists across centuries to depict Christ in an idealized and exposed form. Some scholars argue that may blur into almost sensualization, especially in Baroque or Counter-Reformation art. And I think that argument is well taken. So the two things are happening here. The artist is using the male body to depict Jesus Christ, and it's dramatizing the flesh, the muscle, and suffering. One thing that does by almost stripping him down, by showing the body, by showing a body that looks real, is to allow users to identify, right? I have a body, he has a body, we are very similar. At the same time, the body is idealized, right? So, we see in earlier art that Jesus is very frail and very thin, but here we see a body that almost looks like classical Greek perfection. So we're seeing two things happening at once. It's a body, it's real, it's like you, but at the same time it's idealized. So this is almost an above human figure, trying to accomplish two things at the same time and keep that dichotomy in your mind. Christ's torso here is muscular yet softened. It's not overly heroic. The abdomen is slightly twisted, allowing them to show motion and that play on dark and light, which is so common in Baroque tenebrism. Dark, light here, creating different emotions. The thighs are very full and they're rounded. This is something we're starting to see a little bit more in Baroque. You see it a lot with Rubens. The pose accentuates the straining of the arms. You can feel the tension in the muscles as the rope pulls against the wrists. Wounds and blood have been added, but very subtly, a little bit of a gloss over that pale skin to dramatize his vulnerability and humanity. The nudity here is almost, and it is present, but it is restrained. It's just enough to kind of draw your attention. And to someone who may not be that interested in the Gospels or in religion, they may be interested in looking at the human body. It might draw them into the story. Part of this is them thinking about the audience. How do we capture the audience's attention? How do we bring out emotion? How do we help people identify with this so we can get the message across? We also see here some of that Renaissance tradition of none of that disorderly or savage looking body hair. A little bit about Velázquez. He's early here in his royal career. He ends up being that famous royal court painter. His probably most famous work is Las Meninas, that work in the Prado in Madrid of the daughters of the king that are going to inherit this kingdom, and all the layers about that. Of course, they're fully clothed. So this is a unique painting. Velázquez is early in his career here. He recently had moved to Madrid to serve King Philip IV. Velázquez was very influenced by a guy named Francisco Pacheco. It was his teacher and his father-in-law, and he began apprenticing with him at age 11. And Pacheco was obsessed with religious orthodoxy and often pressured artists to follow specific theological themes. But Velázquez actually developed his own style on top of that, and it was grounded in realism. Instead of a completely heavenly Christ, he's giving us this man who suffers with a tangible body that's weary and wounded. Velázquez would have already known a bit about life, even though he was 29 years old when he painted this. He had been married to his master's daughter since he was 19. He got married when he was 19, the daughter was only 15. They already had 2 children. He would also go on to have several lovers and an illegitimate son. I imagine he knows a lot about emotions and something about suffering. His major influences were Titian, the Venetian painter, and Caravaggio, the Italian. And he had traveled to and studied in Italy. He was also influenced, of course, by Michelangelo and Raphael, who influenced Titian and Caravaggio. Something that's really fun to do is to compare any painting that you see and that catches your eye with some of their most famous works, or some of the works that might have influenced them. So I'm going to do that briefly here before we go on to the next extremely interesting piece that shows the male body a little bit differently. In this one, Christ Contemplated by Velázquez, you have Christ here almost completely nude, but this nudity is showing submission, pain, vulnerability, and idealization. The lighting here is very interesting on him, and I'm going to compare it to some other paintings. But take a look at that lighting. It's hitting his back, and the back is dark, the front is lit. So now we get to play with the body here and show different parts and different angles and different muscles, but it's also saying something like, look at the front, look at my face, look at me calling out to you. The lighting caresses that musculature, but the body is not celebrated. It's being given up as an offering. Now let's compare this to one of Velázquez's most famous works. This work we're looking at today is not one of his most famous. It's just a beautiful piece that I'm exploring with you and bringing to life at the National Gallery in London. One of his most famous pieces is called The Forge of Vulcan, and it was painted just a few years later in Italy. There in that painting, Velázquez unapologetically displays the male body in full, sun-drenched glory. Let's take a look at this masterwork, The Forge of Vulcan, or Apollo in The Forge of Vulcan. These are shirtless blacksmiths with glowing torsos, toned arms, classical, sometimes contrapposto stances. These men are not broken. They are admired, they're desired, they're paused in their sweat and muscle, and it is clearly influenced by Caravaggio or Michelangelo. It's almost like one of their dreams come to life. So we're seeing definitely an evolution here just in those 3 years. And there is no reason to believe that there were homosexual undertones specifically put in by Velázquez. There's nothing in history to suggest that about him. Of course, there was about Caravaggio and about Michelangelo, but it's showing that he is very much following in their tradition and in their footsteps, and very much open to portraying men in art in a way that isn't necessarily always hyper-masculine or heroic, but even putting working men in vulnerable poses, which is very, very interesting. You also see a little bit of a hint of chest hair on one of the men. Maybe that's because he's considered more working class, which goes and speaks about another one of the things about how we depict the male body. You can have a touch of that savagery of realism if you're a real person, but not if you're a god. I think it's a little bit of a bad thing that stayed with us till this day, but this is what's going on in art. It's important to understand those conventions. This painting has everything. It was a way of safely admiring male beauty because it was mythological. It gave them the excuse. It's telling the story of Apollo here, and he's interrupting Vulcan in his shop to tell him he's being cheated on. So here you see beauty, betrayal, drama, flesh. The story and the painting literally have something for everyone because it's a story about a man and fidelity and his wife, but it also gives a little glimmer and kind of shout out back to Caravaggio and Michelangelo in just this almost sensual appreciation of the male body. I'm spending a lot of time with Velázquez, probably more so than the other pieces I'm going to in this video, because he's such an important painter and because he painted such a breadth of the human body. I'm going to show you for a second how he painted the female body, because it was also very much on that line between possibly presenting it in a desirous way, getting it somewhat anatomically correct, and also showing it in an idealized, almost godlike form. One of his most famous works is called the Rokeby Venus. It's actually his only surviving female nude. It is just as beautiful as any of his male nudes. He presents the female body as remote, reclining, turned away. Her face is blurred in the mirror. It's the shape we're invited to contemplate, not the person. So I would point out that there's something a little bit different there. And it might point to his heterosexuality, actually, because the woman is meant to be looked at as just the form and the shape, which was kind of common in a culture that may have seen women as less or been more sexist than it is today. Whereas the men can have faces, they can be humans, they can be a little bit more relatable, even if they are also desirable. One more influence that I want to talk about with Velázquez, especially you can see it if you look at the Rokeby Venus, but you also see it in the men, is that he was probably influenced, ironically enough, by the Sleeping Hermaphrodite, which is one of the most famous sculptures in the Louvre in Paris. It was originally part of the Borghese collection. It is a marble figure that appears to be this gorgeous reclining woman from the back, but if you walk around, you discover actual male anatomy in kind of an obvious way. It's a really fascinating and beautiful thing to see if you are in the Louvre, and even more fascinating when you think about the cultural context of the time that this was made and painted and seen as such a beautiful thing. Kind of says a lot of interesting things that are worth exploration in a separate video or essay. But clearly, his Venus of Rokeby was either influenced directly by the Sleeping Hermaphrodite, which he may have seen in Italy, or by people who were influenced by it. And even the men are influenced by it, because the Sleeping Hermaphrodite and his men and women carry a grace. The men carry a grace that's traditionally reserved for female forms. They almost have rounded hips, they have that gentle lighting, and they have vulnerable expressions. So we don't know how much of the way he depicted the male body in the Forge of Vulcan, or in the painting we talked about today of Jesus being whipped and submissive. We don't know how much of that is him playing with drama and emotion and intensity, and we don't know how much of it is just artistic convention. But that's what makes art so interesting. And once we understand these conventions, we can see how different artists portray these conventions differently and shine their personality through. So, was the male body in Velázquez's paintings, and especially the one we looked at today from the National Gallery, was it meant to be sensual? We don't know. But we cannot deny that it somewhat is. But what we know for sure is that it was meant, once it got your attention, to also be instructional, or at least that's what the sponsors wanted. Through Velázquez's brush, the body, the male body in this case, becomes the lesson. We're not just meant to witness the pain, we're meant to feel it in the flesh. That tension between physical beauty and spiritual torment is exactly what drives us into the next painting. Next, we're going to go backwards in time, and we're going to see the male body depicted completely differently. We're going to go back to 1500 here in the National Gallery of London. This painting is called the Deposition. The artist is the master of the St. Bartholomew Altarpiece. They used to think that the author was Roger van der Weyden, who has one of the most famous altarpieces in art history, but it's now seen as kind of a hyper-emotional offshoot of his school. This painting is one of the most theatrically crowded and emotionally charged depictions of the crucifixion aftermath in Northern Renaissance art. Despite its religious solemnity, it exposes the male body with startling intimacy. Christ's dead form is not glorified, it's sagging, it's pale, but it's nearly sensual in its vulnerability. This is a really interesting piece if you take it apart. Let's first talk about what exactly are we seeing here, and what was the context in which this was painted. So you know the main character, this is Jesus, and he has just been taken off of the cross. His lifeless, naked body pretty much, is being gently lowered by Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Women mourn below, including a grief-stricken Mary, mother, and a delicate Mary Magdalene, and other saints and attendants. A skull and a chalice at the bottom represent Golgotha, the place of the skull, and the sacrificial blood of Christ. Several of these figures, all of them males, are touching Jesus, very actively caressing his body or clutching him, supporting his arms, kind of fingers going deep into the skin. It's making him the center of a very physical and emotional drama. So keep in mind that that is the first and foremost, what we're doing with the male body in the late medieval, early Renaissance times. It's not an idealized form. We're using the body to convey emotion. We want you to emotionally connect with the Catholic Church. We want you to feel the suffering. And we also want you to feel that kind of brotherhood and connection among the faithful. We are touching each other so closely. We are connected almost in the flesh. How exactly is the body portrayed? Well, it is nothing like Michelangelo's heroic Christ. This is a body completely emptied of life, but it has luminescent skin, accentuated even by that gold background, and it causes our eye to be drawn directly to the flesh. His loincloth is very loose and very sheer. This is doing something a little bit suspicious. It's kind of teasing exposure, and makes you wonder why. Why should it be so sheer? Well, one reason is to show vulnerability and exposure. There is nothing protecting Jesus anymore. He has given it all up. Another reading, of course, because there is always subtext and other possible readings in art, is that it is meant to be almost striking to the point of titillating to the viewer. And again, this is to either to get someone's attention, to make the body relatable, to make human emotions and human desires relatable, or it can also sometimes be coded plays on sex and sexuality. We can never really fully know, and we have to remember the container in which all of this art was created. But I do find it interesting. He is being grabbed only by men. Obviously, their clothing is more appropriate to the northern late medieval and Renaissance times than it would have been to anything at the time of Jesus. But we see that, of course, all the time. The clothing is meant to be more similar to the people who are actually looking at the painting so that they can relate. But look at how the men are holding Jesus. Some might say it is almost paternalistic or like a parent, and some would argue that it has even more connotations, because look at the guy in the blue and the beautiful cape. He's kind of holding Jesus right there. He's got his legs wrapped around him and his arm wrapped around him. That could have been suggestive for some. We never know what's really going on in art. We have this other guy kind of reaching down from the rafters, kind of dangling himself just in order to hold that arm. Two of the most interesting things, I'm going to say three. First is the hand. To me, the hand looks almost like Gollum. It's very clear that the flesh has been pierced, that he was held up like that, and that we are meant to emphasize the pain and the suffering. Look at those fingers. Those fingers scream real human hand and agony. There's actually no ecstasy in those hands, and really none in the face. The face is forlorn, emptied, and sad. You can see the droplets of blood from that crown. Catholics were meant to emphasize suffering. And if you look at the feet, you can see it even more clearly. There is not much flesh on his bones. He was not indulging in many feasts prior to this. He was hungry and thin and leaving the desires of the body. At the turn of the 16th century, when this was painted, Cologne, the city in what is now Germany, which is probably where it was painted, where the artist was mostly active, it was a hub for emotionally intense religious art. So this was kind of almost the counter-Reformation before the Reformation. It was aimed to move the heart, not just the mind. The emphasis was very strongly on personal suffering and mystic identification with Christ's wounds, especially through the visual consumption of his body. So this altarpiece likely served a devotional function. You're meant to trigger compassion and guilt and empathy, all three which are human emotions, and all three which can draw you more tightly into the church. There are some art historians, neither of which I'm incredibly familiar with. One is named Michael Camille, the other is Leo Steinberg, and they argue that there was a sensualization of Christ's body in late medieval and Renaissance art that was not accidental. They say that it was a way to invite intimacy, submission, desire, spiritual, and to kind of mix it all in and really, give people a reason to look at these paintings and to come to church. Camille suggests that the body of Christ became a screen onto which male viewers projected emotional and sometimes even more than emotional longing. I don't particularly see it in this work, except for maybe the kind, almost like the S curve resembles a bit of some of those sensuous poses that we saw in earlier Greek sculpture. But Steinberg famously wrote, "No artist could show the body of Christ without confronting the body of man in this time period." So it is very clear that whatever the reason, the devotional male nude or semi-nude, protected only by a very thin veil here, was meant to be touched with the eyes, lingered on, and adored while at the same time feeling their emotions. So there are basically only two times in human experience that happens. And that's when people are in pain and you want to empathize and comfort them, or in moments of deep intimacy. There's always going to be a little bit of mixing when you look at great art. This is a gaze that is invited, and it's not just spiritual, it is bodily. So in that space between mourning and desire, religion and beauty, something sensual happens which relates the human form, the male form, to the higher power and brings us into that kind of artistic moment where we're understanding ourselves more deeply and perhaps understanding the church and its teachings in a different light. Or at the very least, this artistic container was allowing artists to express themselves and ideas that they couldn't otherwise express, and for people to experience things and see things that they couldn't otherwise see. The first painting, Velázquez's Christ Contemplated, gave us the tortured body of Christ lit softly in quiet darkness. Here that suffering is brought out into gold and it's cradled, kissed, held, and exposed. Both works center on how male suffering and male beauty can provoke emotion. Next, we shift gears entirely into the mythological world with the painting called Drunken Silenus. Here, the male body is no longer beaten and adored, but overripe, indulgent, and dangerously on display. The same male form, but in a totally different context and shape. Super quick before we move on to the next amazing artwork in this series, I'd like to ask you to click the like button if you're enjoying this video so far. It's actually really helpful to the channel if you do that. If you don't like it, you could click the dislike button, but to be honest, that actually helps the algorithm too, because somehow YouTube believes that any attention is good attention. If you have a comment, you can ask it at this time, or you can wait till the end and leave it in the comment section. I still read almost all the comments myself. And if you have not yet subscribed, think about doing that and maybe hitting the notification bell so you'll know when the next video like this comes out. Now, going on to the next work. So here we go. We're moving ahead 120 years. We're skipping from the medieval through the Renaissance back to the Baroque. And this is a Flemish, which is northern, follower of Rubens. The painting is from the 1620s and it's called the Drunken Silenus or Silenus. The painting gleefully breaks every rule of classical beauty. It's such a fun piece to see here at the National Gallery in London. If you want a little bit of perspective, it is not a small painting and there is a bench nearby. And it doesn't get as many viewers as some of the other more famous works. So you actually have a chance on most days to sit and really take it apart with your eyes. It's a lot of fun. It's one of the most unapologetically sensual depictions of the nude male in Baroque art. And when I say that, I mean sensual in almost a very literal sense. All of the different senses. We have touch, we have smell, we have taste because she's giving him grapes. We can feel the wind kind of blowing through the air and we can see the light and the darkness. This painting is a full scene. It is meant to be a lot of fun for the viewer. It is meant to provoke and talk about those emotions that we don't always talk about, and it's one of the greatest functions of art. The figure of Silenus is loved and manhandled at the same time. He's obviously criticized through the gaze of the viewer. And at the same time, while he's old and swollen, he's treated, both by the people in the painting and by the artist, with a bit of reverence, humor, and maybe even desire, which is a paradox that we rarely see. And it is really fascinating if we're going to talk about the male body in art or how the male body is seen at all through culture's eyes. This is a deeply Bacchic scene with underlying tension between pleasure and collapse. Is it meant to extol the virtues of having a good time, or is it meant to be a moral lesson of chaos, and that if we follow these desires, we'll eventually end up in a bad, unruly state? Now, this was not painted by Rubens. You might be thinking it is because it looks a lot like Rubens. Rubens was the most famous Flemish painter of this period, but it was painted probably by somewhat of a protege, Anthony Van Dyck, even though they're not totally sure who painted it. But it is in that tradition of Rubens. And remember, Rubens is one of the supreme painters of emotion. His art feasts on the irrational and sometimes even the subtly erotic. It includes some of European art's most influential images of violence, turbulence, cruelty, but also elation and human satisfaction and playfulness, all of those extreme emotions which are quintessentially Baroque. Let's give you a little bit of background into the myth of Silenus before I talk about each and every character in this painting, because it's so fun to just let your eyes travel around this work of art. So much better than watching a screen and doom scrolling and letting different video images pass you, trying to suck away your attention. Here, we are the active agent. We have this beautiful canvas, and we can use our eyes and go all these different places at our own pace. Silenus was the wine-soaked tutor of Bacchus. Bacchus is the Roman name of the Greek god Dionysus. Here, he's too drunk to stand. He's being held upright by one or two satyrs and other attendants as he staggers beneath a fruiting tree. Of course, the fruiting tree having its own symbolism. There is probably a faun who is playing the flute. There are two putti, putti are children that are shown in paintings. They're similar to cherubs in religious art, but they're not having a religious connotation. They're actually put here for a different reason. They're put here to contrast their childlike innocence with this craziness going on up above, and that's creating even more of the stark emotional tension, because that's what Baroque art is all about. Remember, there's not that many categories in art history, and once you learn the basics, it's a lot of fun, because you see how they all fall into place. You have Renaissance, like Michelangelo and Raphael, where we're bringing back the ideals of classical Greece and Rome. Then you have Baroque, you're skipping a little bit, but mainly Baroque, which is more drama, more light versus darkness. Then you're going to go into smaller movements like neoclassicism, where you're going to have Rococo after Baroque, which is like Baroque on steroids, then neoclassicism, then realism, and then you'll go into modernism. But Baroque is one of those main categories, and once you have basic familiarity with it, it's a lot of fun. We're getting to experience a lot of human realities and emotions in this painting. We're going to get to think about and see excess, aging, fertility, desire, lust, abandon, loss of reason, all of these things in a painting. Now, the most fascinating thing about this myth of Silenus, so remember, we're going back to Roman myths, but we're in Baroque times. So we're going back 1,500, 2,000 years sometimes. And we're hearkening back to these old lessons that have been told in our culture for the longest time. Silenus was this mythological figure. So he was basically called the mythological figure of intoxicated wisdom. So he's drunk and he's ridiculous, but at the same time, he was said to utter profound truths in his stupor. So in ancient art, Silenus is often ugly, but here he's painted with lush realism, like a kind of a drunken Roman senator at a feast. And it's not 100% true that he's being painted here in an ugly way. There's almost something beautiful about his form, even though it's so different than the ideal that we're used to. We can see in his face, in his scrunched up, ruddy face, that he's definitely losing control of some of his senses, and that in his wrinkles, he is not young, even though, and he's old, even though his hair is a beautiful, flowy white. But he is also said to have been possessing a special wisdom that comes from that abandon. So I find this very interesting. He's kind of like the drunk old man who utters these wise sayings that no one else would have been able to come up with because their mind is too stuck on the rules and the discipline of everyday life. So unlike the images of Jesus where they bothered to cover him with a bit of a loincloth, this guy's completely nude, and he is fleshy, he is human, he's rosy, he's rounded, and he's heavy. But he is not treated as grotesque. When you see this, you are not disgusted if you have any bit of neutrality in your view. Unless you're one of those people that automatically thinks that old is disgusting, which is kind of disgusting in and of itself. But you're not, the average viewer who sees this, you're gonna feel almost intrigued and playful, and it's gonna make you almost question what beauty is, because this is not grotesque. It's just different. Even though it's rounded and heavy and almost what you might say sloppy, it's also soft, it's also warm, and it's also very much alive, which again is ironic because he's pretty drunk. The skin sags and it wrinkles, but it glistens with that age and in that excess. His thighs are still strong, and his muscles are still noticeable. The character of Silenus here in this painting definitely exemplifies the tension between sensuality and repulsion, and makes you question everything you think about what beauty is and what should be sensuous and what should be out of bounds and ridiculous. Let's talk about the other characters in this painting. First, you have the characters that are holding up Silenus. They are not completely human. So here we, of course, are going back to those Greek and Roman myths about people that are part animal, which really basically says that all humans are part animals, which we are, and it reminds us of that. But it's a way to kind of escape into that. They're furrier, they're hairier, their ears are a little bit pointy, which is signifying also that they're not exactly like us. They're allowed to be more lustful, they're allowed to be more raucous, and they're allowed to be more wild. I mean, especially you can't miss that the one who is on the right and is on Silenus's right, actually, and our left, is just a furry beast below the waist, and even a bit above it, it looks like he's clasping Silenus's hand. So it's interesting because these are supposed to be wild creatures, but they clearly have this consciousness to support their wise leader. There is no way that you could read this painting without thinking that either the artist had an intention of being suggestive, or somebody did, or that it's read that way, because the one holding him up has a face that to most adults would signify a bit of a different kind of ecstasy. And also it's very suggestive that his hand, which is darker skinned, right? Darker skinned is more wild, darker skinned is more out in the woods, but that darker skinned hand is reaching around his belly, getting close to the kind of the front there as he's supporting him, right? Or is he just supporting him? We don't know. Also, in this painting, I'm laughing because I love the face. There is a man playing 2 flutes. He's blowing 2 flutes with his mouth, fitting them both in there, which is funny in and of itself. His face is very well done. Look at all those wrinkles below the eyes. Look at those rosy cheeks. This is obviously, again, northern art. Northern people tend to have more rosy cheeks, so it looks more like them. He's got that northern red hair. We see a blonde woman there. But the music, of course, is meant to accompany this type of celebration of abandon. We have a woman who is, clothes are almost kind of falling off there, and she's right below a tree that looks like it could be an apple tree, maybe a pomegranate tree, which we know what that symbolizes in the Bible. That is the fruit we're not supposed to eat. And of course she has grapes, and grapes symbolize wine, which lets us let loose of our inhibitions. We've already talked about the man really joyfully supporting him. And then we talked about the putti at the bottom, the children, which are meant to contrast with that innocence. Again, they are lighter skinned. And in the final back, I believe that is a woman who is carrying the torch, although I'm not 100% sure. Usually it would have been a woman with a picture like that. It actually could be a man, or it could be meant to be a little bit ambiguous. But definitely being come onto by another one of those ribald satyrs. She doesn't look that incredibly upset about it, and we can only imagine what might happen if we lose control of our emotions. We don't know too much about the guy who probably painted this, Van Dyck. He definitely had numerous relationships with women. He had a mistress named Margaret Lemon, and he later married a Mary Ruthven, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Henrietta Maria of England. But he was known to be famously charming, elegant, well-dressed, and moved easily through aristocratic circles. I imagine that he did so because he understood humans very well and all of their conflicting emotions. He was the court painter to Charles I, and his portraiture often celebrated idealized male beauty. But in this case, he's just celebrating all different forms of male beauty. So coming after the quiet, devotional intensity of Velázquez and then going to that really rich, sacred beauty of the other painting that was similar to Van der Weyden, this is a total tonal shift, but it continues the theme of men's bodies being watched, handled, and symbolically loaded. We've gone from suffering and being out of control of your own body to being out of control, perhaps in another way, and surrendering to the pleasures and desires of existence. In our final piece that we're going to examine today, when looking at the male body in art at the National Gallery in London, we're going to see a man writhing on an altar to talk about what the story behind it means and what are the other subtle messages that might be being conveyed here. This man writhing is not in pleasure, but in fear. Can you guess which Bible story this is talking about? This final painting is one of my favorite paintings in the entire National Gallery, and that's actually saying a lot because it is one of the best museum experiences you can ever have in your life. London is such a fantastic city. It has so many heavy hitters that this museum doesn't even get as crowded as something like the Louvre, but it's one of the greatest places you could ever go to. This painting is a miracle to look at. There is no way that you can look at this painting, whether or not you know a lot about art history or know nothing about art and art history, and not be amazed, even if you know nothing. The interplay of the colors is going to strike your eye. The realisticness is going to catch your eye. The way light hits different places is going to stimulate you visually. It's not a small painting. It's not tiny. You can step back. You can get closer to it. It's really so much fun. And of course, beyond the fact that it has almost a triangular thing going on, which also affects our eyes, the centerpiece is that beautiful male form laying there on the altar. Not only is it beautiful, the first thing you think of is, wow, what a beautiful body. If you believe that the human body is beautiful or that the male body is beautiful, you can't help but think that looking at this. And then you immediately see the knife over him, and you see another man pushing on his chest, and his face and head completely arched backwards. There is no resistance. There might have been some resistance in his arms, but they are tied behind his back. He has a white wrap around him, but it's almost falling off and almost revealing. That happens a lot in classical art. And the whole scene is meant to combine Bible stories, moral lessons, and visual and sensual thrills. Let me tell you about the story, the Bible story that's going on here, and then we'll talk about how this artist decided to depict the male body. If you haven't guessed it already, this is the classic Bible story of the sacrifice of Isaac from the book of Genesis, one of the most important stories for both Christians and Jews. The old man in the painting is Abraham, the father of three of the world's greatest religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Abraham had struggled to have a child, and he finally received God's blessing, and his wife was able to conceive. The child that they had was Isaac. You see Isaac laying there with the blindfold. Now, you will see this image in many different paintings and in many different illustrations and in many different stories. And a lot of times he's depicted as a young boy, but that's probably wasn't the case. This model and the person in this painting looks like an adult, and he probably was. He could have been anywhere from early teens to 30s, but most people think that based on the Bible story, he was probably in his early 20s, like 19, 20, 21, something like that. Isaac did not know what was about to happen, but Abraham, the father, was told by God that he had to sacrifice his son, just like you would sacrifice a ram in biblical times, as an offering to God. And this would have been the absolute hardest thing for Abraham to do, because not only was it his only son, but it was so hard for him to have a son. And it was so important in those times to have a son. And apparently he loved his son very much, and it didn't matter. What was most important in this Bible story was that he was obedient to God, and that he would always trust God no matter what God asked him to do. So despite his personal agony, Abraham took his son away, didn't tell his wife what was going on. He knew he was going to sacrifice his son. He didn't tell his son that he was about to be sacrificed. And then he tied him up, laid him over this rock. I don't believe there's any biblical reason to believe that he was mostly nude, so that was a choice of the painter, which again gets into how and why the male body was painted. But this moment captures a very dramatic scene that is in the Bible. And in that scene, at the last minute, just as Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, and the son isn't putting up much of a battle because he totally trusts his father like a good Jewish boy would at the time, an angel intercedes. And you see that angel, he or she has flown down and has grabbed the arm of Abraham to stop him from plunging that knife into his own son's chest. We know that this relates to the sacrifice of animals, and we can even see the little ram's head over there to the far left of the painting. This story is one of the most foundational stories in the entire Bible. It's in the first book of the Bible for both Jews and Christians, which is Genesis. And it is the basis of a lot of our values and stories over the years. It is meant to convey how difficult it is to be a human and to follow God's word. It's so difficult to follow God's word that you might be asked to do things that are extremely painful, and you should do them anyway. That's the message. Total devotion and submission to God. Just the same way that Isaac, the young 20-some-year-old man, is doing by showing his submission and bending backwards over that rock. Now let's talk a little bit about, from an artistic standpoint, why the male body is portrayed this way. I think a lot of it is an excuse to paint the male body and its form and its muscles. Because if you think about it, Isaac, there's no way if I thought that I was about to be killed, I would be relaxed enough to let my head fall backwards in that passive stance. I would be tense, I would be rigid, I would be trembling. I wouldn't be that loose and flexible. There's no way my legs would be like that. They wouldn't be in that pose with my knee kind of up, like I'm lounging on a chair. So actually, to me, this is kind of allowing us to duplicate the male body as it was done in classical Greek times, but with a new Baroque sensibility, showing a little bit more twists and turns, a little bit different of a view of the male body, and also to play with the light differently. Look at how the light hits directly on his chest, because that's meant to be the focal point. And you can also see how that darkness accentuates his rib cage. It looks almost like he's taken a deep breath in because he's ready for it. His stomach is very youthful. It doesn't have ripped abs. It's almost a canvas in and of itself. And again, you have the wrap that was around him almost falling off, inviting the viewer who may not be interested in Bible stories to come into this scene in an almost sensual way. And again, I mean the word sensual in the sense of activating the senses and activating every part of the human brain, because it intrigues you. Am I attracted to this man, or do I empathize with this man? Do I feel his pain? And is that the ideal male form? Is that a beautiful thing to look at? Why am I drawn to it? And once you're caught up in this painting, then you're vulnerable to the Bible story. The sacrifice of Isaac was a favored subject in the Counter-Reformation and Counter-Reformation art. What is the Counter-Reformation? Well, first we have to ask, what was the Reformation? The Protestant Reformation was when people were rebelling and leaving the Catholic Church. So the Counter-Reformation is an attempt to get them back. How do we get back people that were turned off by the Catholic Church? How do you ever get anyone's attention? Through emotion, through drama. And like a woman I used to know said all the time, she was a performer, sex sells, honey. So if you put a little bit of hints in your painting, you're going to get that attention. So what's going on here is the church is saying, be emotionally stimulated and know that this church, this Catholic body, This relationship that you can have with the Catholic Church and with Rome is the place for you to experience and to master all of your human emotions, no matter what those are. Are you feeling something when looking at this painting? Do you identify with this older man? Have you been a bad parent? Do you desire this man's body? If you do and you're a man, that's wrong, but you can come here and we can help you with that. Do you desire it if you're a woman? You shouldn't, because you're not married to him, and we can consecrate your marriage and we can give you a place to confess. The Catholic Church needed to communicate directly with the emotions of its parishioners. That's what's going on in the Counter-Reformation. And it was very much pronounced in Spain and in the Netherlands, which was related to Spain. The painter is probably unknown to you, as it was to me until I discovered this painting. His name is Juan de Valdés Leal. He was born in 1622. And he was known for memento mori paintings, theatrical altarpieces, and brutal depictions of death and martyrdom. This painting was painted probably when he was in his 40s. He was trained in Córdoba and Seville, and he was exposed to the sensuality of the painters Murillo, Ribera, and Zurbarán. He was also influenced, obviously, in my opinion, by Caravaggio. I also see a little bit of El Greco, but he used Caravaggio's dramatic tenebrism to bring this painting to an emotional, intense climax. So the motivation of the painter may have been to please his patrons and to follow the conventions of the time and to paint beautiful things. But if he was influenced by Caravaggio, then more is going on. Caravaggio was famous for being an outlaw, and he was famous for his love of painting men. Caravaggio's most famous paintings included two paintings called The Sacrifice of Isaac, or Abraham and the Sacrifice of his son Isaac. One of them is in a collection in Princeton, New Jersey. It's from 1598. And the other one is in the Uffizi, one of the greatest museums of the world, just like the National Gallery, but it's in Florence. If you look at Caravaggio's paintings of the Sacrifice of Isaac, first of all, the most striking thing you're going to see is that tenebrism, that use of light versus dark. And remember, light versus dark is meant to mirror the emotions that you're feeling, the dark emotions and the light emotions. Clearly, Caravaggio influenced later painters, and there is no way that you can look at these paintings by Caravaggio and not think that he was playing with the idea of death and sacrifice, and at the same time, sexuality that was outside of the norm and should not be spoken of. Because if you look at the way he depicted them, there's just no way to not think that they are suggestive. In the one, Abraham has him kind of in front, and he's grabbing his hair. The other one, he's grabbed him by the back of the neck. You can see the pale white flesh. The dad's face in those paintings is not in as much agony as you would expect. And there's just a lot going on there. You have to remember that, like I said in the beginning of this video, the religion and the myth is not always the only story. It's the container. You have to paint within that container, but within that container, you can send other messages to people who might get it about the things that you find beautiful or the struggles that you might have internally that you think others might identify with. Caravaggio's definitely doing that. And the painter that I talked about, Valdés Leal, is either doing the same thing or following after Caravaggio and Michelangelo. Regardless, the resultant work is stirring to the eyes of anybody, regardless of whether you understand the story or not, because you're human. The color, the light, the human body, the expressions of emotions on the faces and as revealed through the body are worth taking some time to see in the National Gallery of London. I want to bring art alive for you to help you not only understand why it was painted, but the subtleties and the undertones that we know were there so that you can relate and have art be almost a type of therapy, a type of entertainment, something without any ads, and something that you can still appreciate to the fullest extent. I hope I've helped you do that in this video. I, for one, find it endlessly fascinating that the male body was thought of as beautiful in different ways, in different time periods, and in different forms of art. And that here in the Baroque, it might encode a tension between piety and the desire, even if the artist wasn't explicit. Here, we're witnessing pain in some ways turned into beauty, but in a way that leaves us questioning and still possibly tense, almost like a cliffhanger that we can't wait to get back to. Across these 4 masterpieces, we've watched the male body stretched, mourned, worshipped, offered, even nearly undone. From Catholic Spain to Flemish altarpieces, myth, martyrdom, the male form is never just flesh. We see more than muscles or wounds. We see intimacy and vulnerability in the male body, in all of that agony and ecstasy, and sometimes even a charged undercurrent of desire. The takeaway from these paintings for me is that the male body, in all its beauty and pain, is not just a symbol of sacrifice. It's an object of fascination in and of itself, the same way the female body is throughout art history. It's just as important as the Bible story or the myth it's exploring, and maybe sometimes it's even more beautiful. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the male body and art at the National Gallery, check out my videos about the male body and art at the Met in New York City. And I have one coming up about the male body as portrayed in ancient and classical art at the British Museum. I'll keep doing this theme if you like it. I love doing videos about art and museums and history and making them emotional, relatable, and sometimes maybe even edgy. I've also done top 10 videos about the Met, so if you want to go to the Met in New York, you'll be able to get a preview. And if you're never going to go, watch and enjoy from the comfort of your home on the big, beautiful screen with no one blocking your view, and see all the beautiful paintings at the Met that you can't miss and you must see in your lifetime. I did the same for this National Gallery in London. What are paintings here that you should not miss? You'll get to see my deep dive into works like Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna of the Rocks, or the Arnolfini portrait, which is the most famous portrait in the whole museum. Check that out in my National Gallery Top 10 video. I've done the same thing for the Kunsthistorische and for MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. I also have videos about different travel and historical sites. Would love to have your comment in the comment section. Remember to like this video if you did like it. That is a good way to give me some feedback and some appreciation and to keep me going on this path. And please show up in the comment section. Let me know what I did right. I love the encouragement. If there's something you feel I got factually wrong, I'd love to hear that too. It's a great place to talk with other people that liked these works. I am not here to present a view that is dogma or orthodox. I'm mainly here to get people interested and to get people talking. So feel free to talk with me. I can't wait to see you in the next video. And thank you for watching this one.